my family. So family parties, there's people running all over, and it's kind of crazy. And one of my nieces is terrified of dogs. Every time it runs by, she crawls, runs into the corner. And I always think to myself, like, why can't you teach your kids not to be scared of dogs? Because, it's a dog. But then I thought back on my childhood, and I think we can all relate that we've had things that we've been scared about that don't make sense. Like, for one, my brother told me that if you run in the street when it's dark, then the monsters will run out of the trees and they'll eat me and then run back in. And so I was terrified to go into the street my entire life. One time a ball rolled into the street and it was dark. And what did I have to do? I had to go into the street to get it, right? So I'm running out there in the street and I pick up the ball, waiting for the monsters to come out and eat me, and it never happened. So I think back and, like, if that experience wouldn't have happened, I never would have overcame my fear of the monsters hanging out of the trees, which is why it reminded me of the story, The Monster Who Grew Small. So I'm going to read The Monster Who Grew Small by Joanne Grant. The Monster Who Grew Small. Far to the south, beyond the third cataract, there was a small village where a certain boy lived with his uncle. The uncle was known as the Brave One because he was a hunter and killed such a lot of large animals. And he was very horrid to his nephew because he thought the boy was a coward. He tried to frighten him by telling him stories of the terrible monsters which he said lived in the forest. And the boy believed that what he was told, for it was not his uncle called the Brave One, the mighty hunter. Whenever the boy had to go down to the river, he thought that crocodiles would eat him. And when he went into the forest, he thought that the shadows concealed snakes and that hairy spiders waited under the leaves to pounce on him. The place which always felt especially dangerous was on the path down to the village. And whenever he had to go along it, he used to run. One day when he came to the most frightening part of this path, he heard a voice crying out from the shadows of the darkest trees. He put his fingers in his ears and ran even faster, but he could still hear the voice. His fear was very loud, but even so he could hear his heart, and it said to him, "Perhaps the owner of that voice is much more frightened than you are. You know what it feels like to be frightened. Don't you think you ought to help?" So he took his fingers out of his ears and clenched his fist to make himself feel braver, and plunged into the deep shade, thrusting his way between thorn trees in the direction of the cries. He found a hare, caught by a leg in a tangle of creepers. And the hare said to him, "I was so very frightened, but now you have come, I'm not afraid anymore. You must be brave to come alone into the forest." The boy released the hare and held it between his hands, saying, "I am not at all brave. In my village they used to call me Miobi, the frightened one. I should never have dared to come here, only I heard you calling." The hare said to him, "Why are you frightened? What are you frightened of?" "I am frightened of the crocodiles who live in the river, and of the snakes and the spiders which lie in wait for me whenever I go out. But most of all, I am frightened of the things which rustle in the palm thatch over my bed place. My uncle says they're only rats and lizards, but I know they're far worse than that." "What you want," said the hare, "is a house with walls 3 cubits thick, where you could shut yourself away from all the things you fear." I don't think that would do any good," said Miobi, for if there were no windows, I should be afraid of not being able to breathe. If there were windows, I should always be watching them, waiting for things to creep in to devour me." The hare seemed to have stopped being frightened, and Miobi said to it, "Now you know I'm not all that brave. I don't suppose I'll see much of a protection. But if you feel I'd be better than nothing, I'll carry you home, if you'll tell me where you live." To Miobi's astonishment, the hare replied, "I live in the moon, so you can't come with me yet. But I should like to give you something to show how grateful I am for your kindness. What would you like to have best in the world?" "I should like to have courage, but I suppose that's one of the things that can't be given." "I can't give it to you, but I can tell you where to find it. The road which leads there you will have to follow alone. But when your fears are strongest, look up to the moon, and I will tell you how to overcome them." Then the hare told Miobi about the road he must follow, and the next morning before his uncle was awake, the boy set out on his journey. His only weapon was a dagger which the hare had given him. It was a long and keen, pale as moonlight. Soon the road came to a wide river. Then Miobi was very frightened, for in it there floated many crocodiles, who watched him with their evil little eyes. But he remembered what the hare had told him, and after looking up at the moon, he shouted at them, "If you want to be killed, come and attack me." Then he plunged into the river, his dagger clutched in his hand, and began to swim to the far bank. Much to the crocodile's surprise, they found themselves afraid of him. To try to keep up their dignity, they said he's too thin to be worth the trouble of eating. And they shut their eyes and pretended not to notice him. So Miyobi crossed the river safely and went on his way. After a few more days, he saw two snakes, each so large that it could have swallowed an ox without getting a pain. Both speaking at the same time, they said loudly, "If you want to come one step further, we shall immediately eat you." Miyobi was very frightened, for the snakes were one of the things he minded most. He was on the point of running away when he looked up to the moon and immediately knew what the hare wanted him to do. "O large and intelligent serpents," he said politely, "a boy so small as myself could do no more than give one of you a satisfactory meal. Half of me would not be worth the trouble of digesting. Hadn't you better decide between yourselves by whom I am to have the honor of being eaten?" "Sensible, very. I will eat you myself," said the first serpent. "No, you won't. He's mine," said the second. "Nonsense. You have the rich merchant. He was so busy looking after his gold that he never noticed you until you got him by the legs." "Well, what about the woman who was admiring her face in a mirror? You says she was the tenderest meal you've had in months." "The merchant was sensed that," said the first serpent firmly. "He wasn't. He was. Wasn't. Was." While the serpents were busy arguing which of them should eat Miyobi, he had slipped past without their noticing, was already out of sight. So that morning, neither of their serpents had even a small breakfast. Miyobi felt so cheerful that he began to whistle for the first time. He found himself enjoying the shapes of trees and the colors of flowers, instead of wondering what dangers they might be concealing. Soon he came inside of a village, and even in the distance he could hear a sound of lamentation. As he walked down the single street, no one took any notice of him, for the people were too busy moaning and wailing. The cooking fires were unlit, and the goats were bleeding because no one remembered to milk them. Babies were crying because they were hungry, and a small girl was yelling because she had fallen down and cut her knee, and her mother wasn't even interested. Miyobi went to the house of the headman, whom he found sitting cross-legged, with ashes on his head, his eyes shut, and his fingers in his ears. Miyobi had to shout very loud to make him hear. Then the old man opened one ear and one eye, and growled, "What do you want?" Nothing," said Miyobi politely. I wanted to ask you what you wanted. Why is your village so unhappy?" "You'd be unhappy," said the headman crossly, "if you were going to be eaten by a monster." "Who is going to be eaten? You?" "Me and everyone else, even the goats. Can't you hear them bleeding?" Miyobi was too polite to suggest that the goats were only bleeding because no one had milked them. So he asked the headman, "There seems to be quite a lot of people in the village. Couldn't you kill the monster if you all helped?" "Impossible," said the headman. "Too big, too fierce, too terrible." We are all agreed on that. What does the monster look like?" asked Miyobi. "They say it has the head of a crocodile, the body of a hippopotamus, and a tail like a very fat snake. But it's sure to be even worse. Don't talk about it." He put his hands over his face and walked backwards and forwards, moaning to himself. "If you will tell me where the monster lives, I will try to kill it for you," said Miyobi, much to his own surprise. "Perhaps you are wise," said the headman, "for then you will be eaten first and won't have so long to think about it. The monster lives in the cave on top of that mountain. The smoke you can see comes from its fiery breath, so you'll cook before you are eaten." Miyobi looked up to the moon, and he knew what the hare wanted him to say. So he said it. "I will go up to the mountain and challenge the monster." Climbing the mountain took him a long time, but when he was halfway up, he could see the monster quite clearly. Basking at the mouth of its cave, its fiery breath whooshing out of its nostrils, it looked about 3 times as big as the royal barge, which is very big even for a monster. Miyobi said to himself, I won't look at it again until I've climbed all the distance between me and the cave. Otherwise, I might feel too much like running away to be able to go on climbing." When next he looked at the monster, he expected it to be much larger than it had seemed from further away. But instead, it looked quite definitely smaller, only a little bigger than 1 royal barge instead of 3. The monster saw him, it snorted angrily, and the snort flared down the mountainside and scorched Miyobi. He ran back rather a long way before he could make himself stop. Now the monster seemed to have grown larger again. It was quite 3 times as large as the royal barge, perhaps 4. Miyobi said to himself, "This is very curious indeed. The further I run away from the monster, the larger it seems. The nearer I am to it, the smaller it seems. Perhaps if I was very close to it, it might be a reasonable size for me to kill with my dagger." So that he would not be blinded by the fiery breath, he shut his eyes, and so that he would not drop his dagger, he clasped it very tightly, and so that he would not have time to start being frightened, He ran as fast as he could up the mountain to the cave. When he opened his eyes, he couldn't see anything which needed killing. The cave seemed empty, and he began to think that he must have run in the wrong direction. Then he felt something hot touch his right foot. He looked down, and there was the monster. It was as small as a frog. He picked it up in his hand and scratched its back. It was no more than comfortably warm to hold, and it made a small friendly sound halfway between the purr and the simmer of a cooking pot. Miobi thought, poor little monster. It will feel so lonely in this enormous cave. Then he thought, it might be a nice pet, and its fiery breath would come in useful for lighting my cooking fire. So he carried it carefully down the mountain, and it curled up in his hand and went to sleep. When the villagers saw Miobi, at first they thought they must be dreaming, for they had been so sure that the monster would kill him. Then they acclaimed him as a hero, saying, honor to the mighty hunter, he the bravest of all, who has slain the monster. Miobi felt very embarrassed, and as soon as he could make himself heard about the cheering, he said, but I didn't kill it, I brought it home as a pet. They thought that was only the modesty becoming to a hero, and before they would believe him, he had to explain how the monster had only seemed big so long as he was running away, and that the nearer he got to it, the smaller it grew, until at last, when he was standing beside it, he could pick it up in his hand. The people crowded around to see the monster. It woke up, yawned a puff of smoke, and began to purr. A little girl said to Miobi, what is his name? I don't know, said Miobi. I never asked. It was the monster himself who answered her question. He stopped purring, looked around to make sure everyone was listening, and then he said, I have many names. Some call me famine, and some pestilence, but the most pitiable of humans give me their own names. He yawned again and then added, but most people call me what might happen.